I want to give you a little background on how this came about, because there are quite a few people on here that aren't from Villa Gardens and may not know the history. As I said, I work here at Villa Gardens, and in the fall of 2018, Villa Gardens resident Nan Johnson, she's on the call. Her little tag is Nan there. She'll speak in a minute. She wanted to make sure that everyone, and I mean everyone, celebrates this centennial, the 100th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment in the year 2020. So in fall of 2018, she gathered a small group of women from Pasadena, and the idea of celebrating on January 1st with a rose float in the Rose Parade was born. So maybe you saw it. It was called Years of Hope, Years of Courage, with the Lady Liberty standing tall. We had 18 distinguished guests, 5 of them descendants of suffragettes, and on the float, and 100 men and women dressed in white walking behind the float in the spirit of a suffrage parade. It was quite a way to start the year. As you know, many celebrations for this year that were planned have been stalled due to COVID-19. But with Nan and a different group of us, we just recently gathered to discuss how do we continue the celebrations. We're calling ourselves 2020 Plus, might have seen that on your flyer. And we're starting with this speaker series during the month that the 19th Amendment was signed. Nan Johnson is the inspiration for all of this celebrating. She spent much of her life in Rochester, New York, the home of the suffrage movement. She served in the legislature in Monroe County for 20 years, taught at the University of Rochester, and was the founding director of the Susan B. Anthony Center at the University of Rochester. She also had close civic ties to Seneca Falls, which is the home of the National Women's Hall of Fame and the Women's Rights National Park. There are many more accolades, too many to mention here, but without further ado, I'll pass the baton to you, Nan.
Doug, do you want to come see Nan?
Oh, I'm unmuted now, am I?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. 2020 Plus continues the theme expressed by Pasadena 2020's float in the Tournament of Roses parade on January 1st. For the tournament, the theme was hope, as expressed by the tournament president, Laura Farber. And this is Laura's wonderful statement. With hope, anything, in fact, everything is possible. Hope is more than simply the possibility of fulfillment. Hope is dignity and respect, joy and happiness, aspiration and achievement. Hope never quits.
I lost my screen.
Through hope,
Everybody.
Through hope, we can aspire to be our best and turn and inspire those around us to reach higher. The Pasadena 2020 float theme, Years of Courage, Years of Hope, celebrated the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. Women won the vote. Our host today is Jean Owen. Jean is a Villa Garden neighbor of mine, and she's chair of the Villa Gardens Activities Committee. Jean invited a friend, Lynne, to speak today, and here, Jean, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, she looks like she's hanging in there.
I'm fortunate to have been at Villa Gardens for 3 years this month, and everything still I'm enjoying is new in my life, including this virtual use of technology. So bear with us. We're getting to be old hands, but it's going to take a while. And along with all the newness of the technology, I have also found in these latter years finding new friends, and particularly through the Pasadena Village, where I am a member. And one of my great finds in the village was Lynne Tuite. And it's interesting how we meet people at this age and stage in our lives, and we connect and we talk and we enjoy the here and the now. But do we really take advantage of finding out the background? And in working on this series and getting to introduce Lynne, I've had the privilege of seeing her background, and I can assure you it's a page and a quarter, small type, if you remember trying to count words for papers for classes. And Lynne had a 40-year career in communications field encompassing broad and very public, private, and community relation activities. She's an entrepreneur. She had a corporate background, and she had very important positions in public affairs. From Washington, D.C., to Santa Monica, California, to Pasadena, California. And she retired as managing partner and co-founder of the View Productions Incorporated. And at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Lynne and let her tell you more about what View is, was, and about herself. So Lynne, take it away.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you very much. It's so nice to be here. And also thank you to Villa Gardens and Dawnine and all the work Catherine and you have been doing to put this together. I'm really happy to be here. But in order to get this film started, I have to give you a little background, but I'm going to have to take you all the way back to the 80s, which for most of us third act people was our mid-career. So that's when all of this happened about the View Productions, the company I started with 3 other women. One of my good friends and a dear working partner was a brilliant professor named Diana Meehan, who was asked by USC to start a new institute at USC. In the 80s, if you recall, there were women's studies programs popping up all over the country at universities and colleges, and we were digging into the things that we hadn't ever talked much about before. And so USC decided they wanted to have an institute for the study of women and men, knowing that with women going back to work and with the whole change in the division of labor and childcare, et cetera, that men were being as affected as much as women. So that's what we did. We started, she asked me if I'd come along, and we started an institute that what we did was go into issues that related to women, and we asked scholars at USC to do papers, and then we would have salons where people came to hear some of the latest things. And that time, latest things, they wouldn't be today. And so what happened, and I'm going to speed this up, is we decided after a while that we were preaching to the converted, because most of the people who came to these salons were people already interested in the issues relating to women, children, and families. And so we decided we wanted to get a bigger screen, and we decided, let's do television. And so through a very long and arduous process, which I won't go into all the details of, with the help of a few very good men, we put together, Diana and I, a wonderful group of women, 4 of us, one of whom was a pro in television, who had been a producer on the Today Show, another who was the first woman who had a talk show in Boston, a women's talk show. And then Diana was the academic, and I was the managing partner, business, making the deals, okay? And so we all learned how to do this, and we decided we were going to do it differently. This was going to be 4 partners. There was no hierarchy. We were going to do this women-wise. And we hired all women, and we managed, through the help of a good man, to get an office at Paramount. So that's where we started. We sat there and we thought, what are we going to do? So we took some of the material that we had from the Institute and started to make issue-oriented documentaries about women, children, and families. So we did some on child labor And that one was great because we changed some legislation by premiering it on Capitol Hill, legislation that hadn't been touched in years and years and years. We did some prenatal care, and infant mortality. I can't do any more for you, but we did a whole series of those, many of which we did on Capitol Hill to premiere, getting a legislator behind us on this so that we could change some things. And it did, in effect, kind of change some things in many cases. So then, with the help again of one of my partners, Pat Mitchell, who was the woman who had started the first talk show, she was interested, people from Turner Broadcasting were interested in talking her into doing another show, something like that. So she made an inroads into Turner Broadcasting, and by a sheer miracle in the 80s, we were granted 6 hours of television to look at the century of women. We decided, since this was the perfect time to do it, because Clinton was in office and he would close out the century, and we of course had a sympathetic ear in Hillary. So we thought, if we get this thing going and get enough big names behind us, someone will listen to 6 hours of television about women. Which I say that now because it's not as strange now, but it was then. So we did that. We decided what we would do is get started by getting a group of scholars together to figure out what would we pluck out to do 6 hours of things in a century that was many more hours worth of important things. And so we got scholars from all over the country and used the Schlesinger Library on the history of women at Radcliffe College, which is the largest archive in the nation, I believe. So the research on this was the longest and hardest part. So we spent the better part of a year researching it and decided that what we had to do, because picking the things that we put in this was the most difficult. There were so many. So we decided that rather than doing it chronologically, as many documentaries are, we would do this by theme. So we had one on work and family, and that would develop the things around that idea. And then we had sexuality and social justice. And then the third segment, the 2 hours, each of these are 2 hours. The third segment was image and pop culture. We took a look at how women have changed that way. But so the segment you are going to see is taken from the sexuality and social justice 2 hours, and we just pulled out a little bit of that 2 hour segment on getting the vote. What else do I want to tell you about this? It also was the year of the woman. That was 1992 when we began this. And that at that time was the year of the woman. There were 65 women in Congress, and we thought it was a huge, big deal, which it was. But we've come a long way since then, and we have a long way more to go. So anyway, this occurred to me, and I've talked to so many of you. Some of you have even seen the documentary, the 6 hour one. This is the story of our lives, because we've lived this whole century. At least some of us have, and if we haven't been here for the whole thing, our mothers were. So it is truly a very topical time for us. I have 4 daughters and 5 granddaughters, so the women in my family didn't know any of this, and I was so thrilled to be able to share this wonderful history with them. So let's get started on it, and we can talk about more later, okay?
Let's have a look at the segment. Thanks, Lynn. This is fascinating.
September 1916. A beautiful young woman named Inez Milholland tours the country campaigning tirelessly for the right of American women to vote. She travels to California, where she pleads with President Wilson to support women's suffrage.
Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?
Exhausted, Milholland collapses, her health depleted by pernicious anemia. She's rushed to the hospital and, despite heroic efforts by her doctors, dies within weeks. She's just 30 years old. Suffrage has its first martyr. The battle over votes for women, often treated as a joke in the press, turns deadly serious.
The situation is dangerous. We often hear the remark nowadays that women will get the vote if they try hard enough and persistently. And it is true that they will get it and play havoc with it for themselves and society if men are not firm enough and wise enough and, it must be said, masculine enough to prevent them.
A lot of people were nervous about what seemed to be a challenge to traditional gender roles, that the view was women should be at home, they should define themselves as wives and mothers. And letting them vote was confirmation that they had roles outside of the family. And to many people at a time of enormous change, this was very threatening.
But support for universal suffrage, the right of all people to vote regardless of race, class, education, or sex, was splintered even among women. One group of suffragists, led by Carrie Chapman Catt, made a case for taking the vote away from illiterate men and giving it to educated women.
The government is menaced with great danger. That danger lies in the votes possessed by males in the slums of the cities. There is but one way to avert the danger. Cut off the vote to the slums and give it to women.
The fight for the vote also divided white and black women.
The National Association of Colored Women is concerned most that women shall have the vote and that the word women shall include colored women without question or equivocation.
Even Alice Paul, who led the National Woman's Party, which fought for suffrage at the national level, was willing to let political expediency undermine justice for black women.
We're organizing white women in the South. We've heard of no activity among the Negresses.
Paul was playing politics. She knew very well black women wanted the vote, but believed the South needed to be appeased if the 19th Amendment, suffrage, was to be ratified.
People said that if you give black women the vote, that's going to be the end of white supremacy in the South. Well, this is, in all fairness, quite a problem to predominantly white women's organizations who needed Southern votes in order to get the amendment passed to get women's suffrage.
Ida B. Wells was a prominent journalist who had gained respect through her bold anti-lynching campaigns. She had organized the Alpha Suffrage Club, the first of many for black women in the country. Racism within the suffrage movement reached a crisis in 1913. Suffragists had planned a strategic march on Washington to put their issue before the eyes of the country. Ida B. Wells demanded to be included as an equal.
The march took place the day before Wilson's inauguration, organized by Alice Paul. I was told I could not march with the all-white Chicago suffragists for fear of offending the South. That word, expediency, was heard again. I was told I could bring up the rear. I would have none of it. When the march started, I appeared out of the crowd of onlookers as the Chicago delegation made its way past me. I simply joined in and marched as I pleased.
Despite the exclusion of black women, the 1913 March on Washington made its point for democracy. By 1916, all of the Western states had granted women the right to vote. But only a constitutional amendment would guarantee the vote to women throughout the country. For that, Congress had to act. But President Wilson had another battle on his hands, World War I. The irony that President Wilson was calling for democracy in Europe, but not at home, had not escaped the suffragists.
If we can send our sons in battle for the right of foreigners to self-rule, then we women should have that same right at home. Are not American women as good as French men?
The war made women even more determined to gain their rights. While Carrie Chapman Catt continued to work on a state-by-state basis, Alice Paul led a militant federal campaign of relentless daily picketing in front of the White House. President Wilson soon tired of the harassment. It was October 20th, 1917. Dozens of suffragists were arrested and sentenced to prison in the Occoquan Workhouse, a notorious woman's jailhouse just outside Washington, D.C. Alice Paul was separated from the others and put in the district jail. All the women demanded to be treated as political prisoners. When that was denied, they embarked on a hunger strike. Infuriated, the prison officials retaliated with the torture of force feeding.
Yesterday was a bad day for me in feeding. I'm vomiting continuously during the process. The tube has developed an irritation somewhere that's painful. Don't let them tell you that we take this well. Miss Paul vomits much. We think of the coming feeding all day. It is horrible.
From the moment we undertook the hunger strike, a policy of unremitting intimidation began. I was taken to a psychopathic ward, and the door was removed from my cell. The matron was told to keep an eye on me all night. And every few minutes she would shine a flashlight in my eyes, making sleep impossible. All night and during the day, there would be cries and shrieks and moans from the patients. It was terrifying. I said to myself, I have to endure this. I have got to live through this. I was interviewed by the prison psychiatrists, and I realized I was only one signature away from being committed to an insane asylum. They kept asking me about President Wilson. They wanted to know if I regarded him as a personal enemy. Paranoia or a persecution complex would be enough to commit me to St. Elizabeth's. I said there was nothing personal in the president's opposition to suffrage. I believe I have never in my life before feared anything or any human being. But I confess I was afraid of Dr. Gannon, the jail physician. I dreaded the hour of his visit.
Paul's tactics proved sound. After 37 days, the prisoners were released without explanation. The powerful persistence of suffragists, along with the war for democracy in Europe, turned the tide in favor of American women. President Wilson did an about-face and urged Congress to pass the 19th Amendment.
I regard the extension of suffrage to women as vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged.
Both houses of Congress passed the amendment. Now it was up to the states to ratify. 36 yes votes were needed. Many suffragists still feared the amendment would go down to defeat. As tension mounted, Alice Paul optimistically sewed a star on her suffrage banner for each of the ratifying states. On August 18th, 1920, just one more state was needed. It was up to Tennessee. A no would deal a fatal setback. A yes would make the 19th Amendment the law of the land. State Senator Harry Byrne received a letter from his mother.
Hurrah! And vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt. I've been watching to see how you stood, but have noticed nothing yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification.
Harry Byrne listened to his mother.
It took George Washington 6 years to rectify men's grievances by war, but it took 72 years to establish women's rights by law. At least 1,000 legal enactments were necessary, and one was a struggle against ignorant opposition. Woman suffrage is a long story of hard work and heartache, crowned by victory.
When the vote was won, it was won for all women, regardless of race. The ballot was just the first step. The leap was Congress.
Okay, so that's the end of that segment. Exciting times, right? Nan only took 72 years, but easily 30 that I can document from what we did in our research. Today there are 132 women in Congress, I think, and 26, maybe 27 in the Senate. So it's good, but not good enough. And in corporate life, in the Fortune 500, only 7%, 7.4% of the Fortune 500 are led by women. But in other words, there are 37 women CEOs, and that's all in this. So there's a lot to go on, but 20 years ago, when we were working on this, there were only 2 women running corporations in 20 years ago. The other thing I wanted to mention was when you might have recognized the narrator's voice. That's Jane Fonda. When we talked about the script for this and the way we were doing it, segmented by theme, we went around Hollywood asking women then. The Hollywood Women's Political Caucus was very popular and powerful even then. So as soon as we mentioned this project, there wasn't one woman who said no when we asked, because the voices, all of this documentary is taken from the words, diaries, newspaper articles, directly from the words of the women in it. So when you hear it, the voices that are spoken are voiceovers, but they're done by all kinds of important people. Nobody said no. We thought, isn't this wonderful? And they weren't getting paid. They were just doing it because they knew it was really important that this story be told. So it was a very thrilling time for us. And I can't tell you how many, I've done the 6-hour thing with groups that are third act kind of people. And it's just thrilling to see how they identify with what all of this history that at the time you're going through it, you don't realize how important it is and what a difference it will make in the long run. So
thank you, Lynn. That it's incredible, and particularly during what we're going through now. It seems like it never ends. But there's a lot of work still to be done, and that's what is happening, I think, all around us during this special time. Do we have any questions or comments from any of you that you'd like to share with us? And I think you just unmute yourselves and talk.
Let me add one more thing, Jean.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention, number one, that there is a full and beautiful series on PBS, on the American Experience series on suffrage. And it's 2 parts, an hour and a half each, so it was too long to try to do it here. But it is a complete and total wonderful history of how it all happened. This is a snapshot, what you just saw. The years before this were just incredibly difficult, and how we women continued to fight is one of the beautiful parts of it. So be sure you can get it on PBS. It's streaming now, so you can get it by going to the American Experience series, and it's in there. So
thank you,
Lynn. Thank you. And it's called The Vote.
Yes.
The Vote.
The Vote.
Right.
Okay.
Lynn,
All right.
thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. Yes, I've seen the one for the 2 nights, 2 hours each on PBS, and they are extremely well done.
Yes.
But I want to say that I refer you all here again to let you be aware of how important what you are doing and what you are saying now is, particularly in this time in which we are living. And I refer you to the farewell remarks of John Lewis, which talk to the future, which is what we all need to really be thinking about. we are working now and accomplishing much, but we have the future that is before us that we really need to bring along. We got the amendment for the vote was a step in progress, a work in progress. And this is what Lewis says, and I think it's so important. Democracy is not an end in itself. It's a work in progress. It's a work of feeling and becoming. And that's what we are still working on for the future. And that's what all of you are doing is so important in that. And I want you all to know how important you are and how important Villa Gardens has been in their support of this float and Laura Farber's marvelous statement about the future.
Right.
And years of hope, years of courage. That's what we're all in and all doing and will be for a while.
Thank you, Nan. And Elaine Story, did you have a question or comment?
Yes. Based on this year, 2020, your particular organization, what is your specific highest priority for women's rights today? Your organization. What is the highest priority we should be working on, or you are working on for women?
2020.
Right now, we call this 2020 plus. It's a follow-up on Pasadena 2020 and the float. The celebration of us getting the vote is a hook for all of us to be able to rally around and move forward. But I always viewed it as a hook to move forward, and that what we would use it for was to have a year long and more, hopefully, as I say, 2020 plus beyond, of events, talks, whatever you want to call them, dealing with the issues that we face as a society. The issue at the moment, probably for most of us, is making sure everybody votes. And that's much easier said than done. There are all sorts of oppression. There are many, many organizations. I want to add one personal thing to this about the women who were force-fed. One of them was a relative of mine, Kate Heffelfinger, and I have a picture of her coming out of the prison when she was released from being force-fed. And it really brings it home to you in a big way. So again, that we know how important what you're doing and what Villa Garden support has meant for us and what you are doing for the future.
Thank you, Nan. Marty Garlett.
Thank you. I was wondering about Black women. My understanding, probably from the PBS special, because I did watch it, was that Black women actually did not get the vote until the Civil Rights Act was passed in the 60s. I wonder if you can clarify that.
The vote did not say, you know, Black or the 14th Amendment supposedly gave the vote to everybody, but we know that it didn't. In fact, it didn't give it to many white women either, because there were comments abroad, the polling place is no place for a lady. It still circulated. And I know myself running for office in 1975, it was not a popular thing to do. Women really didn't belong in public office then. So we've had a lot of change. But the important thing is that we passed, again, the amendment didn't solve everything. We passed the Civil Rights Amendment, then we passed the various amendments in the 1969, which gave more women the permission to actually be at the polling place. I will say to you that Pasadena 2020, the float operation, would not have happened without the support of the National Council of Negro Women. And from here and from all over, they were marvelous, and they marched and they put together all the kinds of work for the float that we needed, and they are really a great support now. And we're still working, obviously, on the problems there, which are more obvious than perhaps ever to us right now. But you know, we're coming to grips with the problems that our society has to come to grips with. It's not just our society, but the world in general. And that was one thing the float could do. It could speak. This float is seen around the world, and very few other things can claim that distinction. So that's something you can all be proud of being part of.
Thank you.
I take your point.
This is Martha. I believe that we're kind of at the same place as we were before, is almost asking people to choose whether you're Black or a woman or you're something else and a woman. It's always this contest apparently about your identity. And sometimes, you know, it's like happened with the march, the Women's March, and the group that started that off, and how it kind of devolved into around ethnic lines and racial lines and things. And what it does is kind of dilute the power of movements when you start asking people to choose.
We're not going to have that anymore.
I want to interrupt. Let me interrupt for a minute. And Martha, please introduce yourself. We also could not have had the flow without the support of the League of Women Voters.
Right.
And Martha's our local president. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Martha.
Oh, yes. My name is Martha Zavala, and just as of June 25th of this year, I was elected president of our chapter, and I think I'm the first Latina, not sure. But I know that we're all working very hard. It's really something that's prominent and in the forefront of our mission as we move toward social equity, that a lot of things, although they're written into the law, not everybody has the equal access. But yes, we were really excited about participating in that float and the placement that we had. It was such a great celebration, and a lot of people stopped by. We were able to touch people from all over the US mostly, but there were people from outside also. And so we were really excited about that. And
Martha's going to be our speaker on this series on the 24th of August.
Exactly. So I'll hold my fire.
Jean, I had a comment.
Thank you for joining us.
Please, Bob.
While we are properly celebrating the tremendous accomplishments, women's suffrage and the role of women in politics and the increasing number in the Congress, it's still kind of hard to believe, but I want to bring up the comment that Republican representative, whom I'm calling Yahoo, but his name is Yoho, who was a real Yahoo, what he said to Ocasio-Cortez. He called her an effing bitch.
Yes, he did.
Can you believe that?
Yes, I won't tell you what I was called sometimes. I won't use the language here.
Yeah, but this is now August of 2020. Don't you think, Nan? It's
well, yeah, but you know, for some, some people, and you know, I have had wonderful support from men like you, Bob, and many others. But for some women, you know, nobody gives up power easily. It has to be fought for in many ways. And for some people, moving ahead and having women in positions of power, real power, is a threat to their masculinity, to their being, whatever. And there's no use fighting with them about that, because you don't convince them, you get them their backs up. So what we have to do, and I'm telling this to myself, and I'm learning it partly taking to heart what John Lewis said, you know, we have to be patient, and we have to teach, and we have to convince, and we can't denigrate. That doesn't help, because we want to bring about change, and we need to bring about, we don't want these idiot militias running around in the country with their guns. I myself would really, one of the most important things to me is to make war illegal. I know it's a work in progress. I know it won't happen overnight, but I want the rule of law under it. So we say it's not a way to solve conflicts.
Gideon, you had a comment.
Yes, I do. Well, I have a comment and a question.
You have a comment?
I have a comment.
Yes. Robert, in a way,
Gideon and then Sally.
In a way, it worked against him because it gave her an opportunity to make one hell of a speech.
Yes, yes.
Which
yeah.
would probably have been, you know, there wouldn't have been the reason to do it otherwise.
Yeah, she did.
So in
Okay.
a way, it had a good side.
Thanks.
Okay,
Gideon? Out of that exchange, don't you think the most positive thing that happened was what Cortez said in public over national television, and she spoke for herself, for every other woman in the country. And I think that that was by far the strongest statement that could ever be made from an incident like that.
Okay, Gideon?
Yeah, just a comment. My mother was a suffragette in Berlin, Germany in the 1920s.
Wow.
And brought that over when she came over in 1937 and continued that to the point where she was at the signing of the 64 voting rights bill.
Oh, wonderful, yes.
And I have a sister, so I grew up in a matriarchy. So in one way, I was very lucky. I was very sensitive to the issues because I saw them all the time. On the other hand, I was not, because I had very strong women in my family. My sister became a bones doctor.
Orthopedic.
Or she became an orthopedic surgeon and had a long, strong career in that, and had faced strong opposition in all the medical schools she went to, including Johns Hopkins and many other places. But the question I have is, I hear, and I mean, if you look at this meeting, as far as I could tell, there are 4 men and 37 women here today. So clearly, the men are in the minority, but the men are part of this process. So my question is, how have the organizations seen the use of men who are positive role models, who want to help, who, in the same way that we have to be a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't care about the slogan, I care about the Black lives. So how can men help women?
For one thing, you need to, when you're doing research on the history of the suffrage movement, you do run across references to a lot of men's groups who were supportive, and you see them marching also, which is not seen very often, but I found it in some of the research that I was doing. So there always have been men who have been supportive and are today. And I have a son and grandsons, and I have to remind women, and men too, but that we bring up the men, and they are part of our households. And we need to be very careful in how we are bringing them up, and the values that we are giving them in regard to their spoken and unspoken attitudes toward females and to female accomplishments. And that's something that I say to all women and have all my life. Remember, we are largely responsible still for bringing up the men in our family. So let's think very carefully about how we do that.
Is there anything structurally we can do now? I mean, I would like to have, I have the time and I have the urgence. I know how to do the vote. I will be very busy come September, October, and November. So I know how to do that, but I don't know specifically how to help women.
Probably the thing that is important now is to actually get the ERA through. It's so close now. My friends in Virginia have been working on this for years now. And of course, it really just is very, very close to the passage. I happen to be invited to the reenactment of the in Tennessee when the young man stood up with a letter from his mother and said he would vote, and we got that amendment through, and how important that was. And I'd been invited, so I got to see that. And you know, we can work on the ERA, and won't solve everything, but it'll give us another piece of the moving forward of what we're doing, you know, and make it another requirement for everybody to realize that. And women, I also, it's important to realize we have made progress and not just be downers all the time on it. We have made progress, men and women together have, and we'll continue to.
Very many from Bill.
Nan, I want to follow up on that with you, because when we started this project in the 80s, and that first part of the century, women had just gotten the right to obtain credit.
Exactly.
Got the right to jobs that for decades were strictly for men. We had reproductive rights for the first time during that century, and also the right to serve in our country's military. Those are rights we just take for granted now, but they were big changes along the way.
They were very big changes. I taught most of those cases when I taught women in law starting in the 80s at the University of Rochester. And I mean, those were extremely important landmarks for us to be. And the credit thing, I had experienced, some of you have heard this when I've done other talks, but I was living in England and I turned 40 and thought I'll buy myself a nice present. And I went into London to a very good store and picked out something I wanted and handed them a Barclay card, which was one of the early credit cards around. And the manager came back with me and he said, "Oh, madam, we will have to get your husband's okay before you can." Well, you can imagine. And I flew to the bank manager in my little town and he said, "Oh, Mrs. Johnson, you'll have your own." And they got me mine. But then I realized, of course, they were giving me that on my husband's credit because I still had no credit line of my own. And it took us ages to really get that established, that women had a right to their own credit. So those are the things that we still are looking for and to work on. But Gideon, I really appreciate your comments about how men can be helpful because, you know, we all love and work and have sons and fathers and, you know, brothers and what have you that are important to us. And we all want to work with them and work together. And
thank you, Nan. You're absolutely right. And I'm sure there are, if we all individually shared even small examples of perhaps a small struggle as for being a woman, but thanks to those who went ahead and made the big sacrifices that we now benefit from. Doneen, would you wrap us up and perhaps give us the names of the subsequent speakers in this series?
Jean, could I make a comment?
Of course.
Yeah, on the subject of what men might do, men and women, but men in particular, is one area where the women are still underrepresented is the corporate world, and particularly boards of directors. If you look at the boards of directors, it's improving. There's no doubt about it. But there are many boards still floating around with one woman on the board of 12 to 15 people. And letters, people who own stock in a particular company can look at that and write a letter to the board pointing out that deficiency and the whole glass ceiling problem. And there are other ways to bring some ongoing continuing, to get into what John, Congressman, called good trouble.
Good trouble. Good.
Yes.
That's a great focus.
Right. Right.
To think about, Bob. That's very helpful, and we all can think about that seriously.
Right. Doneen?
Thank you all for being here. This felt like a great success. I like that conversation at the end. Thank you, Bob, for bringing up AOC. And obviously this series is focused on voting, whether it's voting with I loved your suggestion, you know, if you're invested in a company and you know they don't have any women on the board, that's your vote as well. We have 4 more weeks to go. Every Monday at 3, same Zoom link, in case you didn't hear me say that in the beginning. Next week, we've got a local historian, Ellen Snortland, coming on and going to do a presentation on her depiction of suffrage. The following week, we will have Martha Zavala, who we heard earlier, and I'm happy to hear her for a longer period of time. She's the current president of our local League of Women Voters chapter. I think I got it backwards. Sorry. Third week is Deborah Hughes. Is that right, Jean?
Yeah, Deborah Hughes.
Sorry. Third week is Deborah Hughes. She's going to visit us from Seneca or Rochester, and just educated me on that, at the Susan B. Anthony House and Museum. She's the director there. Lots of good discussions about Susan B. Anthony.
In March.
The diversity comes up on that subject, and obviously we know that 72-year struggle, Susan B. Anthony was that first generation. Then Martha, on August 31st, we'll have Ken Morris. I'm almost wanting to apologize because he's our only man speaking, but he is a direct descendant of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. He's fascinating, and I'm very excited to have him wrap us up.
He wrote on the float.
And he wrote on our float.
Yeah.
And so did the national president and CEO of the League of Women Voters, who are also on the float. I want to mention that while Martha's on the call. Yes, go ahead, Carolyn. Was that Carolyn?
Just one thing for Gideon and saying, what can you do? I know about 2, maybe 3 weeks ago, the Pasadena Library did a Zoom presentation that was called Suffragents, and it featured the men who were primarily the ones who were the most helpful during the whole 72 years. So that was a very interesting, and they may have it archived somewhere if you want to look at it.
And that would be great to see. I haven't seen that, Carolyn. I would love to see that.
So I hope you'll...
Doneen, may I suggest that you try to find a Black woman to speak?
Oh, we have.
What's happening now, this is our 5 weeks for August, and Nan and some other people are working forward, and we hope to have continued conversations and nationwide, probably skip September, do October, November. We're not there yet, but that's what 2020 plus is about. And if you want to join in those conversations or help us get more ideas for the future, feel free to call me call the front desk of Villa Gardens, ask for me. We'll rope you into getting you in that loop. We have plenty of suggestions. We have some good people and ideas, and you're right, we need more diversity, Bob. We completely agree. Nan has that connection with National Council on Negro Women. We're looking for somebody from there.
They have their annual conference, in the big one in Washington at the end of September, and they have asked me to be a speaker at it with Janetta Cole if we can work it out. So I'm looking to that. But I'm working constantly with that group here because they were, we couldn't have done the float and the whole business without the group here. They have been intimately involved. They were all involved in walking. We have designations on the float, but also Native American women and Asian women. And I was very adamant that the whole float represent multiculturalism, and particularly in this community, but because the float spoke to the world around, it was doubly important. And it, of course, is very, very important that we make sure that we get that out now for any more organizations that we're doing. And, I hope that 2020 plus is going on plus in next year, in 21 and 22, all of you,
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And I would challenge the men to invite a friend to come on. Let's have 8 men next week. We'll hold you accountable and more even. But thank you so much for joining this effort. It's very exciting, and it's wonderful to see so many people so interested.
Thank you for the invitation, and I'll do my part trying to get a little diversity. Les platico en español cuando es mi turno.
Bueno, mi amiga.
Nan,
adios.
Nan, what years were you what years were you in Rochester?
Oh, I was in Rochester from 1957 through well, I wasn't completely away, but I retired to the Outer Banks of North Carolina in 2002. So I spent most of my adult years, and from a young woman on in Rochester. So I was there doing.
Did you ever go to the Jiva Theater?
Oh yes, many times.
I founded that.
Oh, we have to talk.
Small world.
Yes.
Let's end with a standing ovation for Lynne.
Yes.
Thank you, Lynne.
Bravo. Bravo.
Thank you for asking me.